Thank you, team, for leading us in song. It's so encouraging to have talented people to lead us like this, so thank you. You know, one of the greatest games I think that was ever invented was the game of hide and seek. I'm guaranteed that a parent designed this game, and I'll explain my reasoning. Part of the reason why I think this is because it's a game that requires very little effort, and you get the credit for playing the game, even though you've really not done a whole lot as a parent. So when I was younger, my kids were younger, they would come in as a toddler, and they would say, "Can we play hide and seek?" And I'd say, "Sure," and I would hold a pillow over my head, and they would come, and they'd say, "Ready or not, here I come," and they would grab the pillow and bring it down, and I got to do this all from the comfort of my couch. I didn't have to move, and I'm getting credit for playing a game with my kid. This is a good thing. Well, naturally, as the kids grew older, my hiding had to develop, and so I started to find the best possible hiding spots in my house. And so one time, the kids came to me, and I would go down to the basement, and I found this section that I'm not going to fully disclose in my basement that I'm saying, this has got to be the best spot in the whole house. And so I laid a blanket down on the floor, and I laid myself on top of the blanket, and then I began to pile blankets and beanbags and all of this stuff on top of me. So much so that when I started to breathe, you couldn't see anything move. That's how much stuff I had on top of me. And I proceeded to take my nap. I got to lay down, and my kids are like, "This is great, Dad's playing a game, and I'm taking a nap." So it's, again, I'm killing two birds with one stone. I'm getting my R&R, and I'm getting credit for playing a game. So I hear it says, "Ready or not, here I come." And they start walking through the house, and I'm in the basement, so I'm hearing the footprints all over the upstairs, and I found you. And then they said, "Where's Dad?" And what started off as one versus the mob, all of a sudden turned all versus Paul. And that's how this worked. And they went around the entire house trying to find me. And I was just laying there motionless, kind of coming up from my nap, and I would start to hear some of these conversations going down, like, "What's for dinner?" And I would text my wife back, "How about pizza?" And so Mom would be like, "Dad just said, how about pizza?" That means he's close enough to the action that he can hear our conversation. And this went on for a long time, and I finally said, "You know what? At some point, I should get out of my spot." And so I came out. And I just tell you, that's an amazing, young parents, if you haven't done this yet, just take it from me. Do it. You'll thank me later. It's a great game. I love it. But you know what? A lot of times, this is how we operate in life, isn't it? Sometimes we're kind of going through life and we're kind of operating out in the open for everybody to see what's going on. And sometimes when we do those things, it's really good. It's like when we've helped someone out, when we volunteered or fulfilled a need and we gave. Those are good things, and those are kind of out publicly. People see that, and that's good things. But then there's other times where we don't want to do that, where we want to hide, where we want to conceal what we've been up to. We want to not be out in the open, and we're hoping that nobody ever sees what we do privately. If they do, we're hoping they don't fully understand what we've been doing privately. We try to conceal some of that. But through all of this, we have been learning through the book of Nahum, and the lesson that he's going to teach us today is that God sees everything and acts accordingly. He sees everything. He sees the things that are done publicly, maybe those good things that we see, as well as the negative things. Sometimes the negative things are also seen publicly. Sometimes he just watches how we deal with life. And as we've continued our series through Nahum, we're going to see how God has witnessed every single thing that the Assyrians have done. Not only that, but he's going to act accordingly. In case this may be your first week here, we've been working our way through the small book, through the minor prophets of Nahum. He was minor because his whole book is only 3 chapters long. I'd invite you to turn to chapter 3 this morning. This book was given to the people of Judah, the Israelites, as they were watching the Assyrians, who were ruthless people, crouching in on their borders, and they were freaking out of their mind, saying, "What's going to happen to us?" And through this, God says, "I see what you've been doing, the people of Judah. You've been trying to honor me, and I want to give you some confidence that I keep my word, that I'm going to work on your behalf. And so he gives them this prophetic word. So he begins in chapter 3 saying, "Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, and no end to the prey." This bloody city to which is referred here is the city of Nineveh. It was the capital city to which is gaining the attention of God. This city was impressive. It's been estimated that the circumference was about 60 miles in circumference. And in addition to that impressive footprint, there was about 120,000 people that were in that city. At least that was what was happened when Jonah went to this city a few years prior to this. They were self-sufficient, self-reliant, and they could have whatever they wanted. And yet this impressive city became the target of God's holy and righteous judgment. So as he begins this pronouncement of judgment, we're going to see three areas that he watches. So let's begin in verse 2. He says, "The crack of the whip and the rumble of the wheel, the galloping horses and bounding chariot. Horsemen charging, flashing swords, glittering spears, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end. They stumble over the bodies." And what we observe is that God watches how people treat others. He watches them. He says, do you understand? He's got the crack of the whip. We can hear that crack and we can feel the ground trembling as the horses are galloping towards them. And they are just brandishing their swords and their spears, and they're cutting down people, and they're taking whatever they want because they had the power so they could do what they wanted. And they said, you know what? It's not a big deal. No matter what you do, nothing is going to stop us. There was no stopping them. And they would go to people and they said, you look like you could be of assistance to me, so we're going to capture you. But you, nope, we don't like you. You don't have what it takes, and we're just going to destroy you right here, right now. And God's watching this, and he says, no. Don't you understand that people are created in the image of God? Don't you understand that they are there, and every single person is valuable in the eyes of God? Every single person retains value. It doesn't matter if their skin color is different. It doesn't matter if they speak a different language or if their hairstyle is different than yours. It doesn't matter if they're rich and famous or if they're poor and unknown. It doesn't matter. It says every single person is in the image of God and therefore should be treated with respect and dignity. And yet the Assyrians, they didn't care at all about this. The Assyrian says, you have something we want, we're going to take it from you. And they degraded them. They treated other people as if they were commodities, there for their enjoyment. So they would declare war on a country simply because they wanted the land or the wealth or the natural resources, or they wanted the personnel. They wanted their people to work for them. And like a bully, they took it. But if that wasn't enough, they humiliated them in the process. They pushed them down and mistreated them. And what God tells us is that mistreatment will not go unpunished. God was watching. He watched them as they interacted with people group after people group, and he says, I'm going to act accordingly. Now, I'll say that God doesn't always stop it immediately from happening. Sometimes he allows it to happen, and I don't understand that, just being completely honest. I wish he would just stop all evil, but that's not purviewed to me. I don't know why he doesn't stop it, but I do know that he is watching, and when he acts, he is going to act with justice, and it will be warranted. He doesn't give a full explanation, but in this case, he does. In this case, he's going to walk us through as to why he's pronouncing the judgment against the Assyrians. They mistreated other people, and he says, nope, you're not going to get any further. Now, at this point, I stop and I start to think through this from just putting myself into the story of what's unfolding before my eyes. If I was one of the Israelite people and I received this word, Nahum received it from God, he's given it to the people, I'm thinking, man, this is awesome. Because up until this point, I would have been really discouraged. They could see the fate of their entire people. It's right there out in the open. And they said, it's coming and I can't stop it. So they just lived in anticipation of a very bad day. They're discouraged and defeated. And that Nahum comes, he goes, guys, I've got a word from God. Let me explain something. God's watching. He's watched how they've interacted with these people. And he's going to act on your behalf here in the coming years. If I was putting myself into the Assyrian people, they didn't know. They just continued on. Like, you're God? Pff, I don't even care. This wasn't given to them. It was given to the people of Judah. They didn't even know that this was coming. And then they just continued living the way they had always lived. It was certainly not new for having an opposing God saying something negative about them. But they just kept on going. And yet the prophetic word was given to the nation of Israel so that they would have confidence that God saw everything is now going to be acting on their behalf. So he continues this pronouncement. Verse 4, and for all of the countless whorings of the prostitutes, graceful and full of deadly charms, who betrays nation with her whorings and peoples with her charms. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and will lift up your skirts over your face, and I will make nations look at your nakedness and kingdoms at your shame. I will throw filth at you and treat you with contempt, and I will make you a spectacle. And all who look at you will shrink from you and say, wasted is Nineveh, who will grieve for her? Where shall I seek comforters for you? And I read those few verses and I'm thinking, you know what? I never heard those verses taught in Sunday school. I was like, what do we do with this? Is that really in the Bible? It is. And what it's going through is prophetic word is a kind of a poetic literature. And we have to understand that what Nahum is seeing coming into his mind, he's just trying to jot it down. He's trying to grasp the concepts and write them down in very vivid language, but in word pictures so that we could understand what was happening. And what's going on here is that God watches people's attitudes towards himself. That's what they're getting at. He says, you, O Assyria, you great and powerful nation, guess what you've been up to? You've been consulting with sorcery and witchcraft and all of these other false gods. And in fact, before they would go into battle, they would have this ceremony where they would consult with these false gods. And they would say, hey, let's go to here. We've got our blessings of our God. Let's go on our war path and take over the next country. And once they captured them, they would force those people either to come into their country, and they would use those people in their ceremonies, or they would just abuse them and say this was in worship of our God. They would bring other people into these very irreverent worship services of these false gods. He says, you've been worshiping the wrong thing. And not only that, if that wasn't enough, you drew all these other peoples into following you, and you've pushed them against me. They were terrible. They would worship them with all of their beauty and all their charm, and God says, I am against you. And not only that, he says, I'm going to shame you for this. There's a lot of conversation in today's culture about guilt versus shame. And sometimes we feel ashamed over something we did. We did something that we feel bad about, and we feel that. But in this case, God said, Assyria, I am going to shame you. You went outside, so far outside, and now I'm going to use you as an example. And so when people see them, they're going to see how God doesn't share his glory. He's not going to share it. He's not going to allow other people to think through, to say, hey, look it, they're the powerful people, and this is what powerful people do, and this is how powerful people worship and how they worship and do this. He goes, no. I'm not sharing my glory with that. In fact, the prophet Isaiah says it like this. He goes, I am the Lord. That is my name, my glory I give to no other, nor my praise to a carved idol. He wasn't about to let the Assyrians continue to defame his name. Nor was he allowed them to perpetuate the idea that they were in charge. God, in all of his majesty, says, I am going to throw the filth at you. You've chosen to walk against me for all of these years, and now you're going to give an account. He judges them for the way they refuse to acknowledge him. And when they do, no one's going to mourn their loss. In fact, they're going to clap their hands and say, they're gone. This is great. They're no longer going to be a threat to us. They're going to be completely wiped out, and everybody is going to be excited about their demise. See, God is concerned with how people interact with him. There's coming a time where all people are going to give an account for who God is and our reactions or our thoughts about him. He's going to say, hey, do you understand that I've given you a lot of time to see my handiwork? Have you understood that I have been offering you grace and forgiveness, and yet you refused to enact or to use it? that at some point, God is going to say, we are going to give an account. A lot of people don't give a thought about who God is or what he's about, but one thing we do learn from this passage is that God is holy. He is holy. He is separate and distinct. He is morally perfect. And although we are created in his image, he is so far distinct from us. And when we come to him, we should come in a spirit of humility, realizing that we are very insignificant in view of God. And he cannot stand when we do not operate under that truth. And although we love to talk about God as patient and love and forgiving, we also have to understand that God is righteous and perfect and just. And sometimes what happens is we like to talk about this side of God's character, the loving, patient forgiveness, and it feels good, and it should. We sing praises and we lift our hands and we say, God's so loving, he's patient and forgiving. So when I mess up, it's really not that big a deal because he's patient and loving forgiveness. But at the same time, he's over on this side, he says, he is righteous and just and full of anger towards sin. And we have to keep both in perspective. If we overemphasize one over the other, we don't have a proper view of God. Some people will live over on this side saying God is a loving grandfather. A grandfather who says, I love you so much and I know you did wrong, but let's go for ice cream. Let's have some fun. It's not that big a deal. I'm not going to make a big rise about it. Let your mom and dad deal with that, but for me, we're having fun. Some view of God. Other people view God and they say, God is just here as a judge, and as soon as I take one step out of line, he's going to zap me with a lightning bolt and make me pay for it for the next 10 years. Both don't represent God. We have to look at this in tandem and we say, God, you are so holy. And yet, in his holiness, he grows even further in his justice towards the Assyrians. He says, are you better than Thebes that sat by the Nile, with water around her, her rampart, a sea, a water, her wall? Cush was her strength, Egypt too, that without limit put, and Libyans were her helpers. Now for us, we may not understand what he is saying here. We may not look at those and say, what are those things, those names? But those were prominent cities that had wealth and power, and yet they became the targets of the Assyrians. So the Assyrians says, we want what they have. And so they did their typical military campaign. They worshiped their false gods, and they went and they sacked the cities. They took all of their stuff. He says, don't you understand? I was watching that too. I watched how you treated them. You went into their city and you took everything from them. You took their wealth, their prominent people, and if they were little value, you had them killed. In fact, this is how he describes in verse 10. Yet she became an exile to the Assyrians. She went into captivity. Her infants were dashed in pieces at the heads of every street. For her honored men, lots were cast. That means people took bets on them and they said, we want this one. And they kind of made up a way to do that. They cast lots. And they all her great men were bound in chains. And no, they did not use their ankles and their hands or their necks to transport them with those chains. They treated them very, very ruthlessly. They were so horrible to people. And so God's watching how these people are interacting and how they're publicly going on defaming not only the people, but himself as they went around mistreating others. But the third area that God watches is that he watches people's thoughts about themselves. These Assyrians, they were so powerful. And they filled themselves up with this thought that I am my own master. I am the person who made it all happen. They were filled with greed. And they boasted about what they did. They looked to these cities and said, look what we did. Look what we accomplished. We expanded our borders and we took over this country. And look how wealthy we are. And look at all of our prominence, how we've advanced in culture. Look at all the stuff we've got. We are simply the best. We are unstoppable. They were just steeped in pride. They're so filled up with themselves. And yet what we learn is that pride will always crumble. Pride will always crumble. In fact, the book of Proverbs talks about this and says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. When the Assyrians, they got to the pinnacle of their military campaign and they've won battle after battle after battle and they amassed all of this wealth, they thought, man, there's nothing that's going to stop us. In fact, everybody around thought that they were simply the best. They held a rather impressive amount of real estate during this time. If you look on this picture, it's the green. All of the green is what they captured in just a couple hundred years. And I'm thinking, that's an impressive amount of land. When you go from a tiny little country to expand your borders that far in just a few hundred years, that was impressive. And right then, I would imagine that the Assyrians felt good because pride feels good in the moment. It does. And as the pride feels good, it says, man, we've got whatever we want, whatever luxury we want to indulge in, we've got access to it. I could imagine that they were saying, yep, what's our next military campaign? Where else can we expand our borders? But God is saying, look at what happened to all these cities you took. They thought the same thing you did. They thought they were impenetrable. They thought they had the wealth and the ability to defend themselves against everybody else. And yet, you, O powerful Assyria, you went in and took it from them. Are you much greater than they are? Now, their pride, they would have said, yeah, I am that great. I am that powerful. But God says, no, you are simply not. You are not more powerful than I am. Do you think that I wasn't paying attention? Do you think that you were going to get away with this? So he describes what's going to happen to them in verse 11. He says, you will also be drunken. You will go into hiding. You will seek a refuge from the enemy. All of your fortresses are like fig trees with first ripe figs. If shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. Behold, your troops are women in your midst. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies. Fire has devoured your bars. Draw water for the siege. Strengthen your forts. Go into this clay. Tread the mortar. Take hold of the brick mold. Draw water for the siege. Strengthen your forts. I'm sorry, I read that already. There will be the fire will devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will devour you like the locust. Multiply yourselves like the locust. Multiply like the grasshopper. You increase your merchants more than the stars of heaven. The locust spreads its wings and flies away. Your princes are like grasshoppers. Your scribes are like clouds of locusts sitting on the fence in a day of cold. When the sun rises, they fly away, and no one knows where they are. Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains with none to gather them. And here there's again that poetic language that is used. And at this point we say, what happened? So if I could summarize what would happen is that as the kingdoms that would be attacked, they would fall back into the fortification of their city. And as the opposing armies would come in, they would bar the gates. And they said, at least we're safe inside of our walls. And they put a lot of confidence in those walls. And what the opposing armies would do is they would come in with their siege weapons and they would start to hit those walls. And they would just hit them and hit them and hit them until there was a hole that broke through. And then they would push their armies through those holes in the walls. While that was going on the outside, the people of the town would start to make new bricks, and they would start to rebuild the fortification. So if they got through that first layer of wall, they would hit the second and the third until they couldn't keep up with the demand of those, with the demand that was needed to repair the walls. They said, this is what's going to happen to you. Your fortification, everything that you're putting all of your energy and stock into is going to come crumbling down. It's not that strong. Your trained military, your officers and everybody, and it's going to lose its strength. They're not worried about being political correct here. They said it's going to be filled up with a bunch of untrained ladies. That's what's going to happen to your military. They're going to be cut down quickly because the army is coming in that is trained. He said, as far as your rulers, all of your leading officials, your kings and your princes and your governors, they're going to be like bugs, like grasshoppers and locusts. They're going to be around for a little bit, but as soon as the battle intensifies, they're going to spread and they're going to fly away, and nobody's going to follow their direction. And as leadership goes, so goes the city. He goes, this is what's coming to you, O Assyria. He's going to issue his divine justice, and he's going to make them pay for what they have done to so many other people. He says, it's done. You're done. So he finishes chapter 3. He says, there is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous, and all who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has come your unceasing evil. We finished this prophetic word, these 3 brief chapters, and we learn that God is paying attention to everything we do in this world. This message came to the people of Judah roughly 50 years before it actually happened. So these people were sitting there watching the Assyrians grow, and as they start to move, they get to feel uncomfortable. They feel, I wonder what's going to happen. And then they found their comfort in God and His Word. But for 50 years, they waited for God to enact His justice against the Assyrians. For 50 years, they waited for Him to initiate His judgment against the Assyrians. But what we learn is that God sees everything and He acts accordingly. That's what's going to happen. And that's what gave them the motivation to continue living in the way that they were desiring to do. They watched how God did this. And here, I get to this point in the story, and I'm thinking, yes! Finally, we got the good guys, the Israelites over here. We got the Assyrians over here. They're awful. They're terrible. They deserve everything that's coming to them. I'm like, finally, the good guys win. That's just how I interpret this. But I wonder, as much as I want to just straight up celebrate that, if we're missing the lessons, if we're missing what God is actually teaching us, as much as we get drawn into the story of what's unfolding before our eyes, are there some lessons that we should be asking ourselves as we conclude our study through Nahum? The first question that we should be asking, how do we treat others? How do we treat them? Do we treat people like they're commodities? Like they're here to help me achieve my ambition, my goals, and my dreams? Do we think about the fact that all people are created in the image of God and thereby deserve my respect and my kindness for nothing that they bring to the table, but because they are in the image of God? How do we talk about them? Do we elevate them or do we put them down? Do we talk positively of other people, or do we talk negatively of other people? How do we talk about people who disagree with us? Politically? Morally? Religiously? How do we talk about those kinds of people? And it was like, but Paul, but they're wrong. I'm not arguing that. I probably would agree. They differ than me, and I can point to why I have the positions that I do, and I can actually stake it on the Word of God. But does that give me a license to be unkind, to push them down, to treat them less than human? And the answer is no. That's what the Assyrians were doing. They treated people like they were commodities and marginalized. But the part that baffles me, as I've thought about this whole account with Nahum and the Israelites and the Assyrians, we know what happened about 150 years prior to this? There's another prophet that went to them. His name was Jonah. Jonah went and delivered one of the shortest sermons ever created by any pastor, all right? It was like 5 words. And it wasn't a very uplifting message. In fact, it was like, you're going to get yours. Good luck. Like that was Paul's paraphrase of what Jonah's message was. He wasn't excited about it because this is the people that he was afraid of, the people that he hated. And he says, I'm not going to them, God. And that's why he took off on his cruise in the opposite direction. He says, he went and he preached this message and people were convicted of their wrongdoing. And they bowed their knees and said, oh, great God, you are so merciful. Forgive us for the atrocities that we have been doing. And they turned from their ways and they got right with God. That was 150 years prior to this one. And I don't understand how we go from 150-year revival to horrible. I don't understand how that moves so fast to do such a knee-jerk reaction, to say we're so sorry and now we're celebrating this mistreatment of other people and the defaming of our God. I don't understand that. But here's what I've understood about human condition. We have short memories. We also don't use the voices that we've been given. At some point, those people who experienced that revival stopped talking. They stopped saying, guys, no. Remember the prophet who came out of the fish and that was kind of weird and crazy, but remember that? They stopped retelling the story. They stopped reliving about God's grace and his mercy. They stopped sticking up for people and saying, these are people created in his image. We can't do this. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. And they started silencing their voice. So as we think about how do we treat other people, that's not just a me thing, how I treat other people. But am I concerned with the other people treating other people? Am I sticking up for the marginalized, for the abused? Am I going to their rescue to say, hey, I've got a voice and I'm going to use it. I've got the wealth, I'm going to use it to further God's goodness. How do we treat other people? We should be asking ourselves that question. Secondly, we should ask, how do we think about God? How do you think about God? How do I think about God? How do we actually view God? For some of us, we love the thought about him as that loving grandfather who sees no wrong. For others of us, we have a different view of this when we say, God, he's just an angry person ready to zap me when I get out of line. See, God is holy, but he's also loving. He is forgiving, but he's also righteous. And we have all of these character qualities that come together to form our amazing God. And we should worship him as that. He is all of that and more. We need to see the character of God, the full character of God, if we're going to have a proper view of God. See, our view of God determines the directions of our lives. Our view of God determines the direction of our lives. If we see him as a strictly loving person who just forgives over all offense, guess what that means? That means I'm just going to do whatever I want, whenever I want, and then say, hey, God, you're faithful and just, and you're going to forgive me of my sins here, and I'm just going to confess it, but I'm not really going to change. I'm not really going to take a step towards you. I'm just going to keep on. That's a misuse of grace. We have to understand that we are going to give an account, and so we have to have that understanding that he's offering his love and forgiveness, but we also have to balance that with his righteous anger towards sin. And we put those two together and we say, God, I want to love you, and I'm going to celebrate your love and forgiveness when I step out of line. I'm going to try my best to not do that. But I also understand, Dad, you are an incredibly holy God. And I cannot stand the thought of you being against me, because that is a terrifying place to stand. The third question, we have to ask ourselves, what are our views of ourselves? How do we view ourselves? Too many times we get so sucked into our own life. We get sucked into the drama of our world, and all of a sudden we start to look at what our hands have done. We look at the jobs that we have and the wealth that we've accumulated. We look at the houses and the cars and the toys that we have and say, look what I did. I did this. I came from nothing and I made something of myself. Look at me. Look at my family. Look at my accomplishments. That's a very pride-filled way of looking at ourselves. Or do we say, God, I'm so humbled that you've given me these things. I'm so humbled that you've entrusted me with these skills and these possessions. I'm so humbled that you thought that I could handle this. May I steward these things well. May I do well by you and use them for your honor and glory. See, our view of ourselves should be one of humility. To say, God, I'm just meager servant Paul, and I'm offering my life to you as a living sacrifice. Do with me what you wish. If you want to bless me with some material possessions, cool. If you would rather not, I'm fine with that too. I'm just going to humbly obey you. See, as we finish our study in Nahum, we should be looking at these types of lessons. We should be asking these types of questions because God is just and he sees everything and he acts accordingly. Now, when we look at this particular story, we had the Israelites and God watched them too. A lot of our attention has been focused on the Assyrians, but he was watching these Israelites. And they just went through a revival in their own history. And they said, we found the law of God and we want to follow him. God, forgive us for not enacting this. And he goes, I see that. I see your attempts to come towards me. I see what you're trying to do. I understand what you're trying to do, and I'm honored with that. Did they do it perfectly? No. Do we do it perfectly? Not at all. But he goes, I accept it. The Assyrians, they never got to that spot in this section of their history. They never came to a spot to say, God, we've done wrong. we would have repented of our ways. We're acknowledging you. If they had, we could have seen a different outcome to their history. As it stands, they were decimated. That impressive territory that we just saw, decimated. So much so that researchers didn't see any evidence of that city for like 2,500 years. It was completely turned over, and it was only under modern excavation that they could see the ruins of Nineveh. But nobody even said, who's Nineveh? Where was that city? People didn't know it because God acted decisively. As we walk through our lives, we need to realize that God is very, very present, and he is watching. Father in heaven, thank you so much for giving us a few minutes these past 3 weeks looking to the story, realizing that you are a just God who saves us from injustice, that you're a God who keeps your word, and that you see everything and you act accordingly. Lord, may we honor you with the way we conduct ourselves in this world. Lord, we love you. We love the fact that you are so far superior than us. I ask that you would help us to live every day in view of that. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.